Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering stories that the powerful would rather you didn't connect. A former prince in handcuffs. A military operation in Latin America drawing comparisons to 19th-century imperialism. And a seismic shift in the world's largest car market that could reshape the global energy landscape for decades.
I'm Maya Clarity, and this is the kind of night where every story on the board ties back to the same fundamental question: who holds power, and what are they willing to do to keep it? We have arrests, invasions, and market upheavals, and by the end of this broadcast, you're going to see the thread that runs through all of it. So stay with us, because tonight we're pulling no punches.
Let's get right into it. Our lead story is breaking out of London, and it is extraordinary. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the man formerly known as Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, the King's own brother, has been arrested. Taken into custody by Metropolitan Police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. Let that sink in for a moment. A member of what was, until recently, one of the most protected families on the planet, now sitting in a police holding cell.
And Alex, I want to be very precise about the language here, because it matters. He is Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor now. Not Prince Andrew. Not the Duke of York. He was stripped of his royal title last year, and that stripping of title is directly connected to his long and deeply troubling association with Jeffrey Epstein. The monarchy itself decided he was too toxic to carry the family name in any official capacity. And now, the legal system appears to be catching up with what the public has known for years.
So let's lay out what we know as of this hour. According to Al Jazeera's live reporting, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was arrested earlier today on suspicion of misconduct in public office. That is a serious charge under English law. It carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. This is not a parking ticket. This is not a civil matter. This is the criminal justice system saying there is reasonable suspicion that a former senior royal abused the powers and privileges of his public position.
And the timing here is critical. This arrest comes in the context of the ongoing fallout from the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, which has been one of the most sprawling investigations into elite abuse networks in modern history. Andrew's friendship with Epstein has been documented extensively. He visited Epstein's properties. He was photographed with Epstein's victims. He gave that catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview in 2019 where he claimed he couldn't sweat and used a visit to Pizza Express in Woking as an alibi. The public saw through it immediately, but the legal system moved at its own glacial pace.
Let's talk about what misconduct in public office actually means in this context. Under English common law, this offense applies to a public officer who willfully neglects to perform their duty or willfully misconducts themselves in a way that amounts to an abuse of the public's trust. Now, as a senior working royal, Andrew held a public office. He was a trade envoy. He had access to state functions, diplomatic channels, and government resources. The question the police appear to be investigating is whether he used any of those privileges in ways connected to his relationship with Epstein or the network around him.
And this is where it gets really important to understand the broader picture. This isn't just about one man's friendship with a convicted sex trafficker. This is about whether the institutions of the British state, the monarchy, the diplomatic service, the security apparatus, were in any way leveraged or compromised. Because Andrew didn't just visit Epstein as a private citizen. He visited as a prince. He traveled with royal security. He opened doors that only a prince could open. And if any of that access was misused, that is exactly what misconduct in public office is designed to address.
Now, the palace's response, or lack thereof, is telling. Since Andrew was stripped of his titles last year, Buckingham Palace has maintained a careful distance. King Charles has essentially excommunicated his brother from the royal apparatus. But let's not pretend that this distance is born out of moral conviction. The monarchy protected Andrew for years. They funded his legal defense. They allowed him to settle the civil case brought by Virginia Giuffre for what was reported to be around £12 million. That settlement, let's be clear, came with no admission of guilt, but it came with a very large check, and the public has always had questions about where that money actually originated.
That's a crucial point. The settlement was presented as Andrew's personal financial matter, but investigative reporters have long questioned whether royal funds or funds from sources connected to the crown were involved. If public or quasi-public money was used to settle a civil claim related to alleged sexual abuse, that itself could constitute misconduct. We don't know yet if that's part of what investigators are looking at, but it would be journalistic malpractice not to raise the question.
And Maya, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. For years, the criticism of the Epstein investigation has been that it only ever seemed to catch the small fish. Epstein himself died in custody under circumstances that half the world considers suspicious. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, yes, but the broader network, the powerful men who visited that island, who flew on those planes, who attended those parties, they have largely escaped accountability. This arrest suggests that may finally be changing.
It suggests it, but I want to temper expectations with realism. An arrest on suspicion is not a conviction. It's not even a formal charge yet. British police can hold a suspect for up to 96 hours before they must charge or release. So we are in the very early stages of what could be a long legal process. But the symbolic weight of this moment cannot be overstated. A former member of the British royal family, in police custody, in connection with the Epstein scandal. 5 years ago, most people would have said that was impossible.
And let's talk about who benefits and who loses here. The British public, and frankly the global public, benefits from seeing that no one is above the law. The survivors of Epstein's network benefit from seeing that the justice system hasn't forgotten them. The monarchy, paradoxically, may benefit in the long run if this is seen as the system finally holding even the most privileged accountable. But in the short term, this is devastating for the House of Windsor. King Charles is trying to modernize and streamline the monarchy, and having your brother arrested is not part of that brand strategy.
Who loses? Well, anyone else in that network who thought they were safe. Because if the Metropolitan Police are willing to arrest a former prince, the message to everyone else connected to Epstein is clear: your title, your wealth, your connections may not protect you anymore. And that should make a lot of very powerful people very nervous tonight.
We'll continue to follow this story as it develops. Now, let's shift to our second major story, and this one takes us across the Atlantic to a situation that is escalating by the day. The Trump administration's military posture toward Venezuela. And to help us understand what's really happening, we're drawing on analysis from Ecuador's former foreign minister, who spoke to Middle East Eye and did not mince words. The former FM described Trump's approach to Venezuela as deeply rooted in colonialism.
And that framing is not hyperbole when you look at the historical record. The United States has a long and well-documented history of intervention in Latin America. From the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected government in 1954, to the backing of Pinochet in Chile, to the Iran-Contra affair in Nicaragua, to the support of coups in Honduras and Bolivia. This is a pattern that stretches back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which essentially declared the entire Western Hemisphere as America's sphere of influence.
So what's happening with Venezuela right now? The Trump administration has been escalating rhetoric and military positioning around Venezuela, framing it as a matter of national security and regional stability. But Ecuador's former foreign minister argues that this framing is a mask. That what we're actually seeing is the latest iteration of a centuries-old playbook where a powerful northern nation asserts dominance over resource-rich southern nations under the guise of humanitarian concern or security threats.
And the resource angle here is absolutely central, which is why this is an energy story. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Larger than Saudi Arabia's. Larger than Iran's. We're talking about approximately 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. And for decades, U.S. foreign policy toward Venezuela has been inseparable from the question of who controls access to that oil. When Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, Washington's hostility intensified. That is not a coincidence.
The former foreign minister's colonial framing is particularly sharp because it forces us to look at the language being used. When the administration talks about bringing democracy to Venezuela, or protecting the Venezuelan people, those are the exact same phrases that European colonial powers used to justify the scramble for Africa, the subjugation of India, the carving up of the Middle East. It's the language of benevolent intervention, and it has always been a cover for resource extraction and geopolitical control.
Now, let's be clear about the Maduro government. Venezuela under Maduro has serious governance problems. Hyperinflation, political repression, a humanitarian crisis that has sent millions of refugees into neighboring countries. These are real issues that deserve serious attention. But here's what the colonial analysis helps us see: the United States is not interested in Venezuela because of human rights concerns. If that were the case, we'd see the same military posture toward Saudi Arabia, toward Egypt, toward a dozen other countries with abysmal human rights records that happen to be American allies.
Exactly. The selectivity of American interventionism is the tell. You don't threaten military action against countries that abuse human rights. You threaten military action against countries that have resources you want and governments you can't control. And Venezuela checks both of those boxes. The oil reserves are enormous, and the Maduro government, whatever its flaws, is not willing to hand the keys to American energy companies.
And this connects to broader energy policy in a direct way. The Trump administration has been explicit about its desire to increase American energy dominance. Drill baby drill, as the slogan goes. But dominance isn't just about what you produce. It's about controlling supply chains, controlling access to reserves, and ensuring that rival powers, particularly China and Russia, who both have significant investments in Venezuelan oil, don't gain strategic advantage in the Western Hemisphere.
That's the geopolitical chess match underneath the rhetoric. China has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector through loans for oil agreements. Russia has military cooperation agreements and energy investments there. So when the Trump administration postures militarily toward Venezuela, it's not just about Venezuela. It's about sending a message to Beijing and Moscow: this hemisphere is ours. And that is the colonial mindset that Ecuador's former foreign minister is calling out.
Who benefits from a U.S. intervention in Venezuela? American oil companies, obviously. Defense contractors who profit from any military engagement. Political figures who use foreign threats to distract from domestic problems. And who loses? The Venezuelan people, who have already suffered enormously and would suffer even more under military conflict. The neighboring countries who would bear the refugee burden. And frankly, international law itself, which is further eroded every time a powerful nation uses force against a weaker one without genuine multilateral authorization.
And we should note that this colonial pattern the former FM identifies doesn't just apply to military force. It includes sanctions, which have devastated Venezuela's economy and contributed significantly to the humanitarian crisis that is then used to justify further intervention. It's a vicious cycle, and it's by design. You strangle a country economically, point to the resulting suffering, and then claim you need to intervene to help. It's a playbook as old as empire itself.
The energy dimension makes this story particularly urgent for our audience. Because decisions made about Venezuela's oil don't just affect Venezuelans. They affect global oil prices, they affect the pace of energy transition, they affect whether the world's largest proven reserves are developed sustainably or exploited recklessly. This is everyone's story.
Now let's turn to our third major story tonight, and this one comes out of Asia but has implications that ripple across every continent. Reporting from the South China Morning Post reveals that China's electric vehicle momentum is slowing. And the reason why is a story about batteries, economics, and the messy reality of the energy transition.
Here's what's happening. Rising battery costs are steering Chinese consumers away from fully electric vehicles, known as battery electric vehicles or BEVs, and toward plug-in hybrids. The South China Morning Post reports that material cost inflation is expected to slow momentum for pure electric car sales this year, allowing plug-in hybrids to regain market share after years of rapid electrification in the world's largest car market.
Let's unpack why this matters so much. China is the world's largest car market. It's also the world's largest market for electric vehicles. What happens in China's EV market doesn't stay in China. It sets the pace for the global energy transition. It determines the economics of battery production worldwide. It influences what every other automaker on the planet decides to build. So when Chinese consumers start shifting away from pure electrics toward hybrids, that sends shockwaves through the entire industry.
And the reason for the shift is straightforward economics. Battery costs are rising because the raw materials that go into lithium-ion batteries, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, have seen significant price increases. This material cost inflation gets passed on to consumers in the form of higher vehicle prices. And in a cooling car market where consumers are increasingly budget-conscious, many are making the pragmatic choice to go hybrid instead of fully electric. You still get some electric driving range, but you don't pay the full battery premium.
Now, the optimistic take is that hybrids are still a step in the right direction. They use less fuel than conventional cars. They reduce emissions. They're a bridge technology. And that's all true. But here's the investigative angle that we need to dig into: why are battery material costs rising, and who controls those supply chains?
That's the right question. The battery supply chain is one of the most geopolitically contested spaces in the world right now. China dominates the processing of lithium, cobalt, and other critical minerals. It refines roughly 60 to 70% of the world's lithium and controls an even larger share of cobalt processing. But the raw materials themselves come from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt, Australia and Chile for lithium, Indonesia for nickel. And every link in that chain is subject to political instability, trade disputes, and price manipulation.
So when we talk about battery costs rising, we're not just talking about simple supply and demand. We're talking about a global resource competition where governments are using trade policy, export restrictions, and strategic investments to control the materials that will power the 21st century economy. China's dominance in battery material processing gives it enormous leverage. The US and European responses, including the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, are attempts to break that dominance, but they're years behind.
And here's where this connects to the bigger energy picture. The promise of the electric vehicle revolution was that it would free us from dependence on fossil fuels. But what we're seeing is that it may simply be replacing one resource dependency with another. Instead of being dependent on oil from the Middle East and Venezuela, we become dependent on lithium from Chile and cobalt from the Congo. The geopolitics change, but the fundamental dynamic of powerful nations competing for control of energy resources does not.
The South China Morning Post's reporting also highlights something that often gets lost in the EV hype cycle: consumer behavior is driven by economics, not ideology. Chinese consumers aren't abandoning BEVs because they've stopped caring about the environment. They're doing it because the cars cost more and their budgets are tight. And that's a powerful reminder that the energy transition will not happen through goodwill alone. It has to be economically viable for ordinary people, or they will make different choices.
And the implications for Chinese automakers are significant. Companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng have built their strategies around the BEV boom. A shift toward hybrids means retooling production lines, rethinking marketing, and competing in a segment where traditional automakers, both Chinese and foreign, have more experience. It could slow the momentum that made Chinese EV companies some of the most formidable competitors in the global auto industry.
Who benefits from this shift? Hybrid technology leaders benefit, certainly. Oil producers get a reprieve, because hybrids still burn gasoline. Traditional automakers who were slow to go fully electric and focused on hybrid platforms may find they made the right bet after all. Toyota, which was heavily criticized for its hybrid-focused strategy, might be quietly vindicated by these numbers.
Who loses? The climate, potentially. Every hybrid sold instead of a pure electric means more tailpipe emissions, more fossil fuel consumption, and a longer timeline to decarbonize transportation. Battery manufacturers who scaled up for a BEV-dominated future may face overcapacity. And the narrative of inevitable, rapid electrification takes a hit, which gives ammunition to fossil fuel interests who argue the transition is unrealistic.
And here's the global energy connection that ties this to our other stories tonight. The same geopolitical forces that drive military posturing toward Venezuela's oil reserves are at play in the battery material supply chain. The same power dynamics that allow a prince to operate above the law for decades are the dynamics that allow mining companies to exploit labor in the Congo with impunity. It's all connected. Resources, power, and who gets to set the rules.
Let me draw these threads together now, because this is where Truth Report earns its name. Look at the three stories we've covered tonight. A former royal arrested for misconduct. A former diplomat calling out colonial resource grabs. A market shift driven by supply chain economics. On the surface, they seem unrelated. A royal scandal, a Latin American confrontation, an Asian market trend. But dig deeper and you see the same pattern in every single one.
The pattern is this: the rules-based international order that we're told protects everyone has always had a two-tier structure. There are rules for ordinary people, and there are different rules for the powerful. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor operated for decades in a space where his royal status shielded him from the consequences that any ordinary person would have faced immediately. It took the complete collapse of public tolerance and the stripping of his titles before the legal system even began to move.
The same two-tier dynamic plays out geopolitically. The United States lectures the world about democracy and human rights while threatening military action against a sovereign nation that happens to sit on the world's largest oil reserves. International law applies to everyone except the nations powerful enough to ignore it. And the language of liberation and humanitarianism is deployed not to help the vulnerable but to secure resources for the powerful. Ecuador's former foreign minister sees it clearly because Latin America has lived it for 200 years.
And in the energy markets, we see the same pattern again. The transition to electric vehicles was supposed to democratize energy, to free consumers from the volatile oil markets controlled by cartels and petrostates. But what's emerging instead is a new resource oligarchy built around battery materials. The same extraction dynamics, the same geopolitical competition, the same pattern of wealthy nations controlling supply chains while the communities that actually live on top of these resources bear the environmental and human costs.
So what's the through line? It's accountability. Or rather, the persistent, structural lack of it. Andrew is finally facing potential accountability after years of protection. But will the investigation go further up the chain? Will it reach the other powerful figures in Epstein's network who remain unnamed and uncharged? History gives us reason for skepticism, but the arrest itself is a crack in the wall of impunity.
On Venezuela, accountability looks like the international community actually enforcing the principles it claims to uphold. It looks like calling a resource grab, regardless of which flag is flying over the gunships. It looks like recognizing that the people of Venezuela have the sovereign right to manage their own resources, even if their government is imperfect. Because the alternative, foreign control of domestic resources, has never in the history of colonialism benefited the colonized people. Never.
And on the EV market, accountability means being honest about what the energy transition actually requires. It requires massive investment in mining and processing that must be done ethically and sustainably. It requires diversifying supply chains so that no single country can hold the world's transportation future hostage. And it requires policies that make clean transportation affordable for ordinary consumers, not just wealthy early adopters who can absorb the premium.
Here's what I keep coming back to. In every one of these stories, the people with the least power bear the most consequences. Epstein's victims waited years for even partial justice. Venezuelan citizens suffer under both their own government's failures and externally imposed sanctions. Congolese miners extract cobalt in dangerous conditions so that the rest of the world can drive electric cars. The costs are always externalized downward.
And the profits flow upward. That's the system working as designed, not as advertised. The gap between what we're told about how the world works and how it actually works, that gap is where investigative journalism lives. That's what Truth Report exists to illuminate. Not to tell you what to think, but to give you the information you need to see the structures that shape your world.
So as we close tonight, here's what we're watching. On the Andrew arrest, we're tracking whether formal charges follow. We're watching to see if this investigation expands to other individuals connected to the Epstein network. And we're paying close attention to any attempts to bury this story under the weight of royal PR machinery. Buckingham Palace has world-class reputation managers. The question is whether the justice system is stronger than the spin machine.
On Venezuela, we're monitoring military deployments, diplomatic language, and most importantly, any moves on oil contracts or sanctions modifications that would indicate the real motivations behind the aggressive posture. Follow the resources, not the rhetoric. That's always been the key to understanding interventions in Latin America.
And on the EV market shift, we're tracking battery material prices, supply chain developments, and policy responses from major governments. Because how the world navigates this transition from fossil fuels to electrified transportation will determine the energy landscape for the rest of this century. And right now, the direction is less certain than the headlines would have you believe.
To our audience, we say what we always say: question everything, verify independently, and never accept the first narrative you're given. The truth is rarely simple, rarely comfortable, and rarely served to you by the people in power. You have to go find it. That's what we do here, and that's what we're asking you to do out there.
If these stories matter to you, share them. Talk about them. Because silence is what power counts on. When people stop asking questions, when the public stops paying attention, that's when accountability disappears entirely. Your attention is a form of democratic power. Use it.
I'm Maya Clarity.
I'm Alex Truth. This has been Truth Report. We'll see you next time, and we'll keep digging until we hit bedrock. Good night.